If you have not heard, Ukraine is on another offensive. A mini-offensive, but an offensive nonetheless. And somehow it is simultaneously receiving more media coverage than it should, but also less media coverage than it should. In fact, I was not sure I was going to talk about this one at all, until I realized that my uncertainty regarding that question was the reason to talk about it. Indeed, there are some interesting strategic things going on involving a river, a key highway, some high ground, and logistical hubs further out. So, here goes. To set the stage, we must go back to August and the start of Ukraine's Kursk offensive into Russian territory. Ukrainian troops achieved a surprise at the operational level. Russia had been so preoccupied with what was happening in eastern Ukraine that it completely discounted the possibility that Ukraine might head north. As a result, by the end of the month, Ukraine held about 770 square kilometers of the oblast, including the city of Sudzha. At one point, it seemed that Russia was in an even worse position, uncoordinated and understaffed, with Ukrainian troops pushing up against a river, isolating a de facto pocket of Russian soldiers. However, Russia eventually redeployed some of its better forces from eastern Ukraine to counter the threat, and the move paid off. In September, Russia took back 126 square kilometers. In October, it was another 86 square kilometers. By November, the effects of North Korean troops providing additional firepower were in full effect. Ukraine lost another 113 square kilometers. Meanwhile, if the goal of the Kursk incursion was to stall Russian advances in eastern Ukraine, a strict interpretation of the situation indicates a failure. The pace of Russia's offensive was slow at the start of 2024, but August perfectly coincides with a rapid increase in the pace. Still, despite those numbers, it remains possible that the division of territorial control there would have been worse in the absence of the Kursk distraction. After all, it is now January. At one point, it seemed plausible that Russia would have captured Pokrovsk by now. Failing that, it seemed that we would have a repeat of the winter of 2023, except instead of the siege of Bakhmut, it would have been the siege of Pokrovsk. Yet Russia remains on the outskirts of the city, despite suffering thousands of casualties per day. And there are more subtle effects of causing domestic instability within Russia, which does not show up on the territorial control measures, but could cause some high-leverage problems in the future. The upshot for Ukraine was that it still held control over a large portion of Kursk as the winter snow was settling in. A full displacement of Ukrainian forces during frigid temperatures, and then later spring rains, would be challenging. Indeed, Putin described the realities of the situation at his end-of-the-year roundtable, telling viewers that, "I cannot and do not want to provide a specific date as to when they will be driven out. Our troops are engaged in combat right now, and the battles are intense. We will undoubtedly drive them out. There is no alternative. However, it is not possible to declare a specific date." Based on the trajectory of things, though, it became easy to conclude that eventually Russia would indeed push Ukraine out of Kursk. And that is why the new offensive is being underreported. There is now doubt about the inevitability of a Russian victory in the oblast, as the parties presently exchange territory west to east. With that, we can now discuss what exactly Ukraine is doing with its new push in Kursk. Here is the segment of interest, with Ukraine's possessions at the start of the offensive here, and again, Sudzha is here. This ring of highway always makes it easy to spot. The action that we care about is an advance to the northwest. There are also unconfirmed reports of Ukraine attacking due north, due east, and also southeast. There is a confirmed Russian advance coming from the northwest as well, but our focus is here. Preliminary estimates put the gains at between 20 and 25 square kilometers. Now, What appears to have happened is that Ukraine surprised Russia, this time at the tactical level. As compared to the initial August push, Russia was aware of the possibility of Ukrainian attacks at the operational level in the theater. But implementing proper defense at the tactical level requires making educated guesses about where Ukraine thinks that Russia's points of vulnerability are. Well, Russia guessed wrong, and Ukraine took advantage. This type of thing is not uncommon in attritional warfare, and it accounts for a good chunk of Russia's gains in the east over the last year. Another explanation being whispered about is that Ukraine found a seam between Russian and North Korean units, essentially exploiting a lack of cohesion between the two groups. This would be worse news for Russia because it demonstrates a fundamental problem with its military strategy, rather than the day-to-day realities of trying to hold a line. But all of that is speculation, and it is probably best not to draw conclusions until better information comes in about the offensive. As for the nuts and the bolts of the maneuver, it was a serious effort by Ukraine. Combined arms, armored vehicles, mine clearance, drones, you get the idea. In the process, Ukraine had three things going for it. First, the attack came from the general Sudzha direction, which is where Ukraine is coordinating its efforts in the region. In other words, Ukraine had plenty of materiel nearby, which tilted the battlefield in its direction. Speaking of tilt, second, the area to the right of the highway is the high ground. There is about 70 meters of decline going in this direction. As a result, Ukrainian soldiers had better protection against fire and better sight lines than their opponents. Finally, Ukraine moved parallel to a nearby river, thereby restricting escape opportunities for Russian soldiers, and also limiting Russia's ability to reinforce the area. To be clear, the river is narrow, as compared to the river much further west that Ukraine had previously tried to trap Russia against. Russia managed to work around that more difficult obstacle. Thus, the current river is far from a proverbial brick wall. But it is better than nothing, and Ukraine is taking advantage of it. And with that, let's close out with two discussions of what Ukraine is trying to do here on a zoomed-out strategic scale. First, on the military front. For the short run, Ukraine's goal is to follow a little further along the highway to reach this settlement. It is Russia's logistical hub for the defense of the Kursk Oblast east of Sudzha. So if you switch flags of control on the map, then Ukraine puts Russia at risk of a domino effect. The flip side is that Russia is already in the area. That is the key difference between operational surprise and tactical surprise. Ukraine got to keep advancing in Kursk for weeks back in 2024 because Russia could not quickly plug up the holes. That is not the case here. So any large gains that Ukraine will make in this direction will have to be done the hard way. The bigger goal for Ukraine would be to push further northeast. Remember, Sudzha is where the highway ring is. For completeness, the nuclear power plant is here. Meantime, Kursk City is northeast, about 55 kilometers away from Russia's local logistical hub that Ukraine is currently targeting. Actually getting there, and then holding the territory, would be a Herculean task. But close the gap to about 40 kilometers, and you start getting into the extended range of some tube-based artillery. Consequently, closing the gap opens up the opportunity for Ukraine to harass many more Russian military targets congregating in the region. And now we can conclude with what is happening here on the political front. And thus we finally get to the reason why Ukraine's new offensive is getting too much media coverage. There has been some discussion that this is Ukraine taking steps to try to convince the incoming Trump administration that Ukraine still has the capacity to capture territory. Well, in the strictest of senses, that is true. And the 20 to 25 square kilometers taken exceeds the 18 square kilometers of Kursk that Russia recaptured in all of December. But keep in mind that Russia is also working in this direction, and 20-something square kilometers pales in comparison to the territorial gains that Russia is making in eastern Ukraine, even with the slowdown in December. It is barely a blip. Obviously, taking territory is better than not taking territory. It would be silly for Ukraine to pass on such an opportunity. However, in terms of meaningfully persuading the Trump administration, 20-something square kilometers is not going to cut it. Ukraine will need to take much, much more territory before this begins to change Washington's political calculus in any serious manner. That is part of why there is some discussion that Ukraine's current actions are just a feint, hiding some bigger strategy that we will learn about shortly. But remember, they are still going up against winter, and that makes changing any political calculus all the more difficult. Meanwhile, you can improve your political calculus by reading these two awesome books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.